On a morning in early 1943, a group of American fighter pilots stood on an airfield in England and stared at their new aircraft with something close to horror. These men had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. They had dogfighted German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over the English Channel. They knew what a fighter plane should look like. The machine before them looked like nothing of the sort. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac like an oversized milk bottle with wings. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded, almost twice as much as a Spitfire, and nearly 3 times as much as the Japanese fighters terrorizing American forces in the Pacific. Its massive radial engine gave it a barrel-shaped fuselage that seemed to mock every principle of aerodynamic design. The wingspan stretched 5 feet wider than a Spitfire. The fuselage volume was roughly 4 times greater. British pilots joked that a Thunderbolt pilot could defend himself from enemy fighters by running around and hiding inside his own fuselage. 7,000 miles away in New Guinea, a 31-year-old lieutenant colonel from Texas named Neel Kearby looked at this same aircraft and saw something entirely different. Where others saw a liability, he saw an opportunity. Where others saw weight, he saw power. He was about to prove every one of those critics catastrophically wrong. The criticism of the P-47 began before the aircraft ever saw combat. When Republic Aviation unveiled the Thunderbolt in 1941, experienced aviators took one look at its specifications and reached a unanimous verdict. This aircraft was too heavy to dogfight. It could not climb fast enough to intercept enemy bombers. It could not turn tight enough to survive against nimble opponents. It was, in the words of one pilot, who would later fly it in combat, a true air inferiority fighter. The skepticism was not unreasonable. Fighter combat since the First World War had been defined by maneuverability. The pilot who could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver his opponent would survive. The pilot who could not would die. By this standard, the P-47 appeared to be a death trap waiting to claim its victims. Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, veterans of the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons who had flown nimble Spitfires against the Luftwaffe, delivered the most quoted assessment when the Thunderbolts arrived. "It damn well ought to dive," he said bluntly, "because it sure as hell cannot climb." His assessment captured the prevailing mood among experienced fighter pilots who had learned their trade in aircraft that danced through the sky. German ace Kurt Bulligan, who would finish the war with 112 confirmed victories, confirmed the skeptics' view from the enemy side. The P-47 was very heavy, he observed after encountering the aircraft in combat, too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 could not follow, and we came around and got on its tail in this way. Bulligan's assessment seemed to prove that enemy pilots had already figured out how to defeat the Thunderbolt. Even the aircraft's designer acknowledged the criticism with dark humor. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian immigrant engineer who created the Thunderbolt for Republic Aviation, admitted it will be a dinosaur, but he added something the critics missed. It will be a dinosaur with good proportions. The numbers that worried pilots told a damning story on paper. The P-47D model weighed 10,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external tanks, it could exceed 17,500 pounds. This made it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire Second World War, heavier than some twin-engine aircraft. Its wing loading of 44 pounds per square foot was more than double that of the Japanese Zero, which meant wider turning circles, higher stall speeds, and inferior maneuverability at low and medium altitudes. The critics had a point, but they were about to learn that being right about the physics did not mean being right about the conclusion. The Japanese fighters that American pilots faced in the Pacific represented the opposite philosophy of aircraft design, and understanding why they were so feared explains why the P-47's arrival seemed so disastrous. The Mitsubishi A-6M0, the terror of the Pacific that had swept American and British aircraft from the skies in the opening months of the war, weighed barely 5,000 to 6,000 pounds, fully loaded depending on the variant. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced around 940 to 950 horsepower, far less than the Thunderbolt's 2,300, but its light weight gave it phenomenal agility. The Zero could complete a half-turn at 240 miles per hour in just 5.62 seconds, a maneuver no American fighter could match. It could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver any Allied aircraft at low and medium altitudes. Royal Navy test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who evaluated captured Japanese aircraft and tested more types than any other pilot in history, judged the Zero to be among the finest fighters in the world until mid-1943. His assessment came from direct experience flying the aircraft and understanding exactly what made it so deadly. But the Zero's exceptional performance came at a terrible cost that would eventually prove fatal. Imperial Japanese engineers had achieved their remarkable agility by sacrificing almost everything else. Early Zero models had no armor protection for the pilot. They had no self-sealing fuel tanks. The airframe was built light, with minimal structural redundancy. A short burst of .50 caliber fire could turn a Zero into a fireball, but American pilots had to hit it first, and in a turning fight, they rarely could. The Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa, known to Allied pilots as the Oscar, was even lighter than the Zero and possibly the most maneuverable fighter of the entire war. It employed special butterfly combat flaps that allowed extraordinarily tight turns no other fighter could match. Japanese Army pilots, flying Oscars, shot down more Allied aircraft than any other Japanese fighter type, despite the aircraft being somewhat slower than the Zero and carrying lighter armament. American pilots in the early months of the Pacific War learned a brutal lesson about these Japanese fighters. At Pearl Harbor, Army P-40 Warhawks were caught on the ground and destroyed before they could fight. In the Philippines, American squadrons suffered crippling losses trying to defend against Japanese air attacks during spring 1942 in New Guinea. American units lost aircraft at ratios of 2 to 1 or worse against Japanese fighters whose pilots had years of combat experience from the war in China. The Japanese pilots Americans faced in those early months were among the best trained aviators in the world. Many had flown hundreds of combat missions over China since 1937. They knew their aircraft intimately and had developed tactics that exploited every advantage their nimble fighters possessed. American pilots, fresh from training schools, found themselves facing opponents who had been killing for years. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots who survived their first encounters with Zeros often reported feeling helpless against an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. The confidence that came from superior American equipment in training vanished when that equipment proved fatally inferior in combat. Morale in Pacific fighter squadrons plummeted as losses mounted. The fundamental problem was tactical. American doctrine emphasized outturning opponents, fighting in the traditional swirling dogfight that had defined aerial combat since 1914. Against Japanese aircraft that could turn tighter than anything Americans flew, this doctrine was suicidal. Pilots who tried to fight Zeros and Oscars died. The survivors learned never to try it again. The solution began with Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a Navy pilot who developed what became known as the Thatch Weave in late 1941. Working at night with matchsticks on a table to simulate aircraft movements, Thatch developed a revolutionary insight that was devastatingly simple: never turn fight with zeros. Instead, American pilots should work in pairs, using coordinated maneuvers that let them cover each other while denying the enemy the close-in battle they wanted. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Thatch's tactics proved their worth. His flight of 4 Wildcat fighters, attacked by 15 to 20 Zeros, achieved favourable results through teamwork and disciplined refusal to engage in turning fights. These principles, along with dive attacks, high-speed engagements, and right-hand maneuvers that exploited the Zero's tendency for controls to stiffen above 216 miles per hour, became the foundation of successful American tactics. Into this tactical revolution came the P-47 Thunderbolt, and into the Pacific came Neel Kearby, a man who would prove that the despised heavy fighter could become the ultimate expression of these new tactics. Neel Ernest Kearby was born June 5, 1911, in Wichita Falls, Texas, the son of Dr. John Gallatin Kearby Jr. and Bessie Lee Stone Kearby. His family moved to Arlington, Texas when he was 13, and he graduated from Arlington High School in 1928. After attending North Texas Agricultural College from 1930 to 1931 and working in Dallas for 3 years, he enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin in fall 1934 to study business administration. He completed his coursework in late 1936 and received his diploma in June 1937. Kearby enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps on February 25, 1937, and received his commission as an aviator on February 16, 1938, after training at Randolph and Kelly Fields in Texas. He served with the 94th and 40th Pursuit Squadrons of the 1st Pursuit Group at Selfridge Field in Michigan until December 1940, gaining extensive experience in the P-36 and early American fighters. From December 1940 to August 1942, Kearby commanded the 14th Pursuit Squadron in the Panama Canal Zone, where he flew P-39 Airacobras and accumulated substantial flight time that would make him one of the most experienced pilots in the Army Air Forces. He married Virginia King Cochran, a red-headed woman he called Ginger, and they had 3 sons named Robert, John, and Kenneth. In October 1942, the Army transferred Major Kearby to take command of the newly formed 348th Fighter Group equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts. The group was activated on September 30, 1942, at Mitchell Army Airfield in New York, before moving to Bradley Field on October 4th, and then to Westover Field in Massachusetts on October 29th. While other pilots viewed the massive aircraft with suspicion and complained about its handling characteristics, Kearby became what one historian later called a hardcore believer in the Thunderbolt. At 31 years old, Kearby was practically ancient by fighter pilot standards in an air force where most combat pilots were in their early 20s. But he had accumulated extensive flight time across multiple aircraft types and possessed something more valuable than youth. He had the experience to understand what the P-47 could do and the analytical mind to figure out tactics that would maximize its strengths. The critics were thinking about aerial combat the way it had been fought for 25 years. Kearby was thinking about how it would be fought in the future. The key insight that Kearby developed was devastatingly simple in concept, but required complete tactical discipline to execute. The P-47 was never designed to turn fight. Trying to dogfight a Zero in a Thunderbolt was like trying to outrun a cheetah on foot. You would lose every time. But you did not have to outrun the cheetah if you could strike from above and disappear before it could react. Kearby developed systematic tactics that transformed the Thunderbolt's apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages. The core doctrine could be stated simply: never lose speed or altitude in combat. Every engagement should begin with the P-47 at high altitude, ideally 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where its turbo-supercharged Pratt and Whitney engine gave it performance advantages over any opponent. Upon sighting enemy aircraft below, the Thunderbolts would dive at speeds exceeding 425 miles per hour, fire devastating bursts from their 850 caliber machine guns, then use their momentum to zoom climb back to altitude without ever engaging in turning fights. The physics that made this work were straightforward. The P-47 could not outturn a zero at any altitude, but above 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was actually nimble and responsive because the thin air negated the Japanese fighters' lift advantage, and in a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. Its massive weight and robust construction let it accelerate to speeds that would tear lighter aircraft apart. A Zero pilot who tried to follow a diving Thunderbolt would find his controls stiffening and his aircraft approaching structural limits while the American accelerated away. The Thunderbolt's firepower made each diving pass potentially devastating. 850 caliber M2 Browning machine guns could fire approximately 100 rounds per second combined, with a total ammunition load of 3,400 rounds. This was enough firepower to literally blow lightly built Japanese aircraft out of the sky. A 2 or 3 second burst from a P-47 put enough lead into a target to destroy any fighter in the world, and if something went wrong, the P-47 had one more advantage that no Japanese fighter could match: survivability. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial, producing up to 2,300 horsepower with water injection. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines in Spitfires, Mustangs and Messerschmitts, a radial engine could absorb multiple hits and keep running. A single bullet through a coolant line would destroy a P-51 or B F-109. A P-47 could come home with cylinders shot away, control surfaces shredded, and holes you could put your fist through. The aircraft's construction contributed to this survivability. Republic Aviation had built the Thunderbolt with redundant control cables, armor plating around critical areas, and structural members that could absorb tremendous punishment without catastrophic failure. The self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire when hit. The turbocharger, mounted in the rear fuselage behind the pilot, added additional protection from rear attacks. Everything about the aircraft's design prioritized bringing its pilot home alive. This survivability would prove crucial in the grinding attrition of aerial combat. Pilots who survived their first few missions became increasingly deadly as they accumulated experience. An aircraft that protected its pilots during those vulnerable early missions meant more veterans in the squadron, which meant better results in every subsequent engagement. The 348th Fighter Group comprised the 340th, 341st, and 342nd Fighter Squadrons. After months of intensive training where Kearby drilled his pilots relentlessly on his high-altitude diving tactics, the group departed on May 15, 1943, aboard the Army transport Henry Gibbons. Kearby demanded perfection from his pilots. He ran training exercises that simulated combat conditions as closely as possible, emphasizing the discipline required to avoid turning fights and maintain altitude advantage. Pilots who reverted to old instincts during training received immediate correction. Those who could not adapt to the new tactics were transferred out. By the time the group deployed, every pilot understood exactly what was expected of them. The pilots expected deployment to Europe, where P-47s were already in combat against the Luftwaffe. When the ship turned south through the Panama Canal, they realized their true destination was the Pacific. This was both good news and bad news. Good because the Pacific Air War desperately needed fighters that could match Japanese performance. Bad because the P-47's limited range seemed to make it nearly useless for the vast distances of Pacific operations. Lieutenant Colonel Kearby reported for duty with 5th Air Force in Brisbane, Australia, on June 20, 1943. The 348th arrived at Port Moresby, New Guinea, 3 days later, becoming the first P-47 unit in the Pacific theatre. They immediately faced the range problem that skeptics had predicted. The Thunderbolt's internal fuel capacity gave it barely enough combat radius for defensive patrols, let alone offensive sweeps over enemy territory. Engineers in Brisbane worked around the clock to develop a solution. They created 200-gallon belly drop tanks with electric booster pumps that extended the aircraft's combat radius, enough for offensive operations against Japanese bases. The modification was crude by peacetime standards, but effective enough for war. The 348th could now reach the enemy. The group flew its first combat mission on August 16, 1943. Captain Max Weeks and Lieutenant Leonard Layton scored the group's inaugural victories that day against Key, 43 Oscars over Wewak. The celebration was tempered by tragedy. Layton was shot down and killed, becoming the group's first combat casualty. The learning curve in the Pacific was measured in blood, and even Kearby's tactics could not prevent all losses. But the learning happened with remarkable speed. The 348th pilots discovered that Kearby's high-altitude diving tactics worked exactly as advertised. Japanese pilots who had dominated American opponents for 18 months found themselves outclassed by an enemy they could not catch or escape. The Thunderbolts would appear from above, slash through formations with devastating firepower, and climb away before anyone could react. By December 1943, the 348th had claimed over 150 confirmed aerial victories while losing only 8 pilots in combat. This was a stunning record that demanded explanation. The aircraft that critics said could not fight was achieving kill ratios that rivaled the best units in any theatre of the war. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, later wrote about meeting Kearby for the first time. About 2 minutes after he had introduced himself, Kenney recalled, he wanted to know who had the highest scores for shooting down Japanese aircraft. You felt that he just wanted to know who he had to beat. Kenney recognized something in Kearby that went beyond flying skill. It was an absolute competitive certainty that he would prove the doubters wrong and become the top ace in the theatre. The general deliberately encouraged competition between his leading pilots, Kearby, Richard Bong, and Thomas Maguire, knowing that men with this drive would push themselves to achieve what others thought impossible. On the morning of October 11th, 1943, Kearby volunteered to lead a 4-plane reconnaissance sweep over Japanese airfields at Wewak, New Guinea. Wewak was one of the most heavily defended enemy positions in the entire theatre, with multiple airstrips, strong anti-aircraft defences, and large concentrations of Japanese fighters. It was exactly the kind of target that would let Kearby prove what his tactics could accomplish. His flight consisted of Captain John Moore as his wingman, Major Raymond Gallagher commanding the 342nd Squadron as element leader, and Captain William Dunham as Gallagher's wingman. 4 P-47s against whatever the Japanese could put in the air. They took off at 9:30 in the morning from Ward's Drome near Port Moresby and climbed to 28,000 feet, cruising toward Wewak at the high altitude where the Thunderbolt was at its best. The October sky was clear over New Guinea, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for the kind of diving attacks Kearby favoured. At approximately 11:15, Kearby spotted a lone enemy fighter below at around 20,000 feet. Post-war Japanese records would later indicate this was probably Lieutenant Colonel Tamiya Teranishi, commander of the Japanese 14th Fighter Bomber Group and one of the most experienced officers in Japanese Army aviation. Teranishi's last radio communication was received at 11:25, matching the timeline of Kearby's attack. Diving from the sun with the aircraft's massive engine screaming, Kearby opened fire at 300 yards and sent the Oscar down in flames with a precision that came from hundreds of hours of practice. One victory on what was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. But the mission was far from over. Minutes later, the flight spotted something that would test everything Kearby had trained his men to do. Approximately 12 enemy bombers flew at around 5,000 feet, with 36 fighter escorts weaving above and around them. Some accounts placed the total Japanese aircraft between 40 and 50. Kearby and his 3 wingmen were outnumbered roughly 12-1 against alert, combat-ready opponents. They had completed their reconnaissance mission. They had gathered the intelligence they were sent to collect. They were running low on fuel after the long flight from Port Moresby. Standard doctrine said to report the enemy formation and go home. Any reasonable pilot would have done exactly that. Kearby gave the signal to attack. What followed in the next few minutes demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of his tactics when executed with absolute precision. Leading the diving attack at over 425 miles per hour, Kearby shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in quick succession on the first pass. The enemy formations scattered as the 4 Thunderbolts tore through them like wolves through sheep. As the American pilots pulled up and began their zoom climb, Kearby spotted Captain Moore, pursued by 2 enemy fighters closing for the kill. Without hesitation, he rolled his heavy fighter over and dove back into the fight. He destroyed both enemy aircraft in rapid succession, saving his wingman's life with shooting that bordered on the miraculous. Even then, with 5 confirmed kills and multiple enemies now aware of his presence and maneuvering to intercept, Kearby made one more pass through the scattered Japanese formation. Only when his ammunition was running low and enemy fighters were closing from multiple directions did he seek cloud cover, regroup his flight, and lead them toward friendly territory. The 4 Thunderbolts landed at Leh with less than 50 to 75 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough to taxi to the parking area. They had pushed their aircraft and themselves to the absolute limit of what was possible. The final tally was extraordinary. Kearby claimed 6 confirmed victories, with a possible 7th that went unconfirmed because his gun camera had run out of film. Dunham scored 1 victory. Moore scored 2. Gallagher had become separated during the swirling engagement, but landed safely. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed, including what was probably a senior Japanese commander, without a single American loss. Upon returning to Port Moresby to report the results, each pilot performed victory rolls over the field. Dunham executed 1 roll. Moore executed 2. Kearby executed 7, 1 for each of his claims, including the unconfirmed. The 342nd Squadron Intelligence Officer, First Lieutenant Bernhard Roth, wrote in his after-action report with barely contained enthusiasm at what he had witnessed. A total of 9 fighters destroyed without a scratch on a single Thunderbolt demonstrates that this type of plane has come into its own in this theatre, and that its terrific speed, both in the dive and straightaway, its flashing aileron roll and murderous firepower will henceforth strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. The official Medal of Honor citation would describe the action in the measured language of military documentation. Colonel Kearby volunteered to lead a flight of 4 fighters to reconnoitre the strongly defended enemy base at Wewak. Having observed enemy installations and reinforcements at 4 airfields and secured important tactical information, he saw an enemy fighter below him, made a diving attack and shot it down in flames. The small formation then sighted approximately 12 enemy bombers accompanied by 36 fighters. Although his mission had been completed, his fuel was running low, and the numerical odds were 12 to 1. He gave the signal to attack. The citation continued. Diving into the midst of the enemy airplanes, he shot down 3 in quick succession. Observing one of his comrades with 2 enemy fighters in pursuit, he destroyed both enemy aircraft. The enemy broke off in large numbers to make a multiple attack on his airplane, but despite his peril he made one more pass before seeking cloud protection. Coming into the clear, he called his flight together and led them to a friendly base. Colonel Kearby brought down 6 enemy aircraft in this action, undertaken with superb daring after his mission was completed. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented the Medal of Honor to Kearby on January 23, 1944, in Brisbane, Australia. Kearby became the first Army Air Forces fighter pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. The previous 16 Army Air Forces recipients had been bomber crewmen or recognized for actions other than aerial fighter combat. Kearby's recognition marked a turning point in how the military viewed fighter pilots and their contributions to the war effort. After the ceremony, General Kenny observed that MacArthur did the thing up right and so overwhelmed Neel that he wanted to go right back to New Guinea and knock down some more Japanese aircraft to prove that he was as good as MacArthur had said he was. The competitive fire that made Kearby a great ace also worried his commanders. By early March 1944, Colonel Kearby had accumulated 22 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring P-47 pilot in the Pacific and tied with Richard Bong for leading Army ace. Both men were racing to break Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 confirmed victories, a record that had stood for over 25 years. Kearby had stated publicly his intention to shoot down 50 Japanese planes. Kenny, who had watched too many aggressive pilots push their luck until it ran out, explicitly warned Kearby to dial back his tactics. "I told him to be satisfied from now on to dive through a Japanese formation, shoot one plane down, and come on home," Kenny later wrote. In that way, he would live forever. But if he kept coming back to get the second one and the third one, he would be asking for trouble. On March 5, 1944, Kearby led a 3-plane fighter sweep from Sador Airfield with Captain Samuel Blair and Captain William Dunham. The mission was a fighter sweep over Wewak, the same area where Kearby had earned his Medal of Honor 5 months earlier. Over Wewak, at approximately 22,000 feet, they spotted 3 key 48 Lily bombers from the 208th Hiko Sentai near Dagwa airstrip with fighter escort above. It was exactly the kind of target Kearby's tactics were designed to destroy. The 3 P-47s dove to attack. Kearby scored his 22nd confirmed victory on the first pass, maintaining his position as one of the top aces in the Army Air Forces. His tactics worked perfectly. He should have climbed back to altitude and headed home. Instead, Kearby made a fatal mistake. Against Kenny's explicit warning and against the tactical doctrine he had spent 2 years developing and teaching to others, he circled back at low altitude to confirm his kill rather than climbing to safety. Perhaps he wanted to verify the victory. Perhaps the competitive drive that had made him an ace clouded his judgment for one critical moment. While completing the turn to re-engage, a Key 43 Oscar from the 77th Sentai attacked from behind and above. The kill was credited to Warrant Officer Koichi Matoma and Sergeant Hiroshi Aoyagi. Dunham spotted the threat and attempted a head-on pass to drive the Japanese fighter away, but he could not reach Kearby in time. Heavy machine gun fire struck Kearby's P-47D4, serial number 42-22668, the aircraft he had nicknamed Fiery Ginger 4 after his red-headed wife Virginia. Dunham watched as Kearby's aircraft began trailing smoke. He observed Kearby possibly opening his canopy, either attempting to bail out or trying to evacuate smoke from the cockpit. Then the Thunderbolt plunged toward the jungle below. Native witnesses in the area later reported that Kearby managed to bail out by parachute at extremely low altitude. He became tangled in a tree and died from the bullet wounds sustained during the attack rather than from impact with the ground. He was 32 years old. In July 1947, Australian war graves personnel conducting recovery operations found the wreckage of Fiery Ginger 4 near Dagwa, New Guinea, approximately 1,800 feet from the airstrip. Remains were recovered and initially marked as unknown, while identification efforts continued. In 1949, the remains were formally identified as Colonel Neel Kearby and returned to the United States. He was buried on July 23, 1949, at Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park Cemetery in Dallas, Texas, next to his brother, Major John Gallatin Kearby III, who had died August 2, 1943, in an aircraft training accident at Charlevoix, Michigan. Kearby left behind his wife Virginia and 3 sons. In a haunting family tragedy, Robert and Kenneth would die together on May 27, 1974, when their aircraft struck power lines below Keystone Dam over the Arkansas River. John died on August 3, 1977. The vertical fin from Fiery Ginger 4, still bearing the bullet holes from that final combat over Wewak, is today displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force alongside a full-sized replica of the aircraft. It stands as a permanent reminder of both what Kearby achieved and the price he paid. Kearby died because he violated his own tactical principles. He went back for a second look at low altitude when everything he had taught his pilots said to climb to safety. The aggressive drive that made him a leading ace was also his undoing. While Kearby dominated the Pacific, European theatre P-47 pilots compiled equally impressive records and demonstrated that the aircraft's vindication was not limited to one exceptional pilot or one theatre of operations. Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group scored 28 confirmed victories in the P-47, the highest total of any American pilot in the European theatre. A Polish-American from Oil City, Pennsylvania, Gabreski had flown with Royal Air Force No. 315 Polish Squadron at Northolt to gain combat experience before America entered the war. He understood from personal observation what the Luftwaffe was capable of, and he methodically developed tactics to defeat them. Gabreski was shot down and captured on July 20, 1944, when his propeller struck the ground during a strafing run against Bassenheim Airfield. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp, but his career was not over. He later became a jet ace in the Korean War with 6.5 MiG-15 kills, ending his career with 34.5 total victories across 2 wars. He remains one of only 7 Americans to achieve ace status in 2 different conflicts. Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group scored 27 confirmed victories, all in the P-47, making him the 2nd highest scoring American ace in Europe. Johnson became famous for an incident that epitomized the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness better than any statistic could. On June 26, 1943, Johnson's P-47 was attacked by a German Focke-Wulf 190 over occupied France. The German pilot made pass after pass, emptying his entire ammunition load into Johnson's aircraft. The Thunderbolt absorbed 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun rounds. Bullets struck the engine, the cockpit, and the control surfaces. By all logic, the aircraft should have been destroyed, but the P-47 kept flying. Johnson nursed his crippled fighter back across the English Channel and landed safely. When ground crews examined the aircraft, they found it riddled with damage. The aircraft was beyond repair, but the pilot was alive. No other single-engine fighter of the war could have survived that punishment. Johnson's memoir, published in 1958 under the title Thunderbolt, captured his respect for the aircraft that had saved his life and helped make him one of America's top aces. Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group, which became known as Zemke's Wolfpack, and earned a reputation as the most aggressive P-47 unit in the European theatre. Under Zemke's leadership, the group became the highest scoring in the 8th Air Force with 665.5 confirmed aerial victories and produced 39 aces. The 56th Fighter Group holds a unique distinction in 8th Air Force history. It was the only unit that elected to remain with P-47s when other groups switched to P-51 Mustangs for long-range bomber escort duties. The Mustang had longer range, which made it better suited for escorting bombers deep into Germany. But Zemke's pilots knew what their Thunderbolts could do in a fight and refused to give them up. Walker Mahurin became the first American double ace in the European theatre on November 26, 1943. He went on to score 19 3/4 victories in Europe, flying primarily P-47s before being shot down and evading capture through occupied France. Mahurin later served in the Pacific, scoring one more victory in a P-51 for a total of 20 3/4 victories in World War II, and then fought in Korea where he added 3.5 MiG-15 kills. Mahurin holds a distinction that no other American pilot can claim. He is the only American with confirmed aerial victories in the European theatre, the Pacific theatre, and the Korean War. His career of 24.25 total victories spans the transition from propeller fighters to jets, and at its foundation was the P-47 Thunderbolt. The 348th Fighter Group that Kearby commanded compiled what became the most impressive P-47 combat record in the Pacific theatre. By the end of the war, the group claimed 396 confirmed aerial victories, accounting for over half of all kills credited to 5th Air Force P-47s. The group earned 2 Distinguished Unit citations for exceptional performance in combat. The first citation recognized the group's support of the Allied invasion of New Britain from December 16 to 31, 1943. The second honored their defense of bombers attacking Clark Field on December 24, 1944. The Clark Field mission demonstrated the group's capabilities at absolute peak performance. Escorting B-24 Liberators on the first major bomber strike against Clark Field in the Philippines, the 348th intercepted an estimated 100 Japanese fighters rising to defend the target. In the massive air battle that followed, group pilots claimed 32 enemy aircraft definitely destroyed and 7 probably destroyed, while the bombers completed their mission and returned without loss. The group produced 20 P-47 aces, carrying forward the tactical legacy that Kearby had established. Captain William Dunham, who had flown with Kearby on both his Medal of Honor mission and his fatal last flight, accumulated 16 victories, with 15 of them in the P-47. George Davis scored 7 victories in World War II while serving with the 348th before the war ended. He went on to earn the Medal of Honor in the Korean War, where he added 14 more kills flying F-86 Sabres before being shot down and killed in action. His career total of 21 confirmed victories across 2 wars stands as testimony to the quality of pilots the group produced. The critics who had dismissed the P-47 were proven wrong by statistics that could not be argued away. The aircraft achieved an overall kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 across more than 746,000 combat sorties flown during the war. P-47 pilots claimed over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the European theatre alone, with more than half of those in air-to-air combat. The Thunderbolt pilots also claimed 20 Luftwaffe Me-262 jets and 4 Arado-R Tu-34 jet bombers, destroying Germany's most advanced aviation technology in their propeller-driven aircraft. The fighter that critics said could not climb fast enough somehow managed to catch and destroy jets capable of over 500 miles per hour. As a ground attack platform, the P-47 proved even more devastating than as an air superiority fighter. From D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolts destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets across Europe. The combat loss rate of 0.7% per mission was the lowest of any Allied fighter aircraft in the war. Total P-47 losses numbered 5,222 aircraft, with 3,499 lost to enemy action and 1,723 to accidents. These numbers sound high until you consider that 15,683 Thunderbolts were built, making it the most numerous American fighter of the entire war. Perhaps the most remarkable statistic requires no calculation at all. The top 10 P-47 aces all survived World War II. No other fighter type can claim this distinction. The aircraft that critics said would get its pilots killed proved to be the safest mount an ace could fly. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Bahr, who scored 220 victories across his career, acknowledged that the Thunderbolt could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Coming from an enemy pilot with that level of experience, the assessment carried weight. American ace James Goodson, who flew both Spitfires and P-47s in combat, concluded that many American pilots preferred the P-47 to anything else. They did not believe that the Focke-Wulf 190 held an overall edge against it. The introduction of paddle blade propellers in early 1944 significantly increased the P-47's climb rate at lower altitudes, addressing one of the original criticisms. German pilots, who had learned to escape diving Thunderbolts by pulling into steep climbs, found that this tactic no longer worked. The aircraft was evolving, and each evolution made it more dangerous. The P-47's legacy extends far beyond World War II. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Air Force's primary close-air support aircraft today, was specifically named to honor the P-47's ground attack heritage. Both aircraft share the same fundamental philosophy that Kearby would have recognized: exceptional durability, overwhelming firepower, and the ability to bring pilots home despite horrific battle damage. Today, fewer than a dozen P-47s remain airworthy worldwide. Only 3 are Razorback models like Kearby's Fiery Ginger with the original high-backed fuselage. In 2015, Indiana named the P-47 its official state aircraft in recognition of the Republic Aviation plant in Evansville that built thousands of Thunderbolts for the war effort. The lesson of what Neel Kearby accomplished should not be forgotten. The critics who dismissed the P-47 as too heavy to fight were not stupid people. They were experienced professionals who looked at specifications and reached logical conclusions based on everything they knew about aerial combat. The Thunderbolt could not turn Fighter Zero. It could not match a Focke-Wulf 190 in a climbing spiral. By every measure that had defined fighter combat for 25 years, it was inferior. But Kearby and pilots like him understood something the critics missed. Air combat was evolving. The swirling dogfight that had defined aerial warfare since the First World War was becoming obsolete. The future belonged to aircraft that could dive fast, hit hard, survive punishment, and climb away to strike again. Speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability mattered more than raw maneuverability. The P-47 Thunderbolt was designed for a kind of war that had not yet been fully understood. Kearby figured out how to fight that war before most pilots even realized it was coming. He developed tactics that maximized the aircraft's strengths and minimized its weaknesses. He proved those tactics in combat against some of the best pilots the Japanese could field, and he trained hundreds of other pilots to fight the same way. Colonel Neel Kearby never reached his goal of 50 victories. The competitive drive that made him an ace ultimately cost him his life when he violated his own tactical principles for one fatal moment. But his tactical innovations, his Medal of Honor, and his 348th Fighter Group's dominance proved what mattered most. The critics were wrong. The results speak across 8 decades. A kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, the lowest combat loss rate of any Allied fighter, 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in Europe alone, 22 personal victories for Kearby before his death at age 32. A Medal of Honor earned in a single morning over Wewak, when 4 P-47s dove into 50 enemy aircraft and emerged without a scratch. History vindicated the men who believed in the Thunderbolt when the experts said they were wrong. The aircraft that pilots mocked as a flying bathtub became one of the most successful fighters ever built. The tactics that Kearby pioneered became standard doctrine. The example he set of proving capability through results rather than arguments echoes through military aviation to this day. The P-47 Thunderbolt was indeed too heavy to dogfight, and it never needed to. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from.